This is Putin's War with me, Mike Graham. We're here every week to digest what's been happening in Ukraine, what the Russians are up to, and what the international community is doing about all the things that have been going on. We'll be bringing you this update every single week. Every Wednesday it's filmed, and I'm in the company once again of Hugh Andree. Hugh, very good afternoon to you. Interesting times this week because Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, shot off to Washington in a bit of a hurry, it would have to be said, and he was described by James Heapy, one of his ministers, as having gone there to have conversations beyond belief were the words he used with the Americans about what was happening in Russia and what the latest threats are. It's not really clear what the outcome of those talks is, but tell us what's been happening on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, this week it's more been about what's in the air, Mike, to be honest. And we saw the kamikaze drones,
yes,
coming in from Russia. Drones are nothing new in the battle space. For those who aren't familiar, they're also known as UAVs, which are unmanned aerial vehicles.
Okay.
They're a much cheaper form of delivery system, although what drones are normally used for is either aerial reconnaissance or the delivery of missiles, explosions, and ultimately death. They also, of course, by the use of drones, therefore, it cancels out the need to send human beings out on what we used to.
What do they actually look like? Because obviously, you know, when I think of a drone, I think of one of those things you see people within the park, you know, sort of flying it up and taking pictures with it. Yeah. But obviously, I assume if this is carrying a weapon, it's a lot bigger. Yeah,
all shapes and sizes, and different costs. And for the record, those small, what we call commercial drones, both Ukraine and Russia have been using those, mostly for the identification of enemy targets.
Right.
The Shahed 136, which is an Iranian-manufactured drone, and I'm sure that was on the agenda with Ben Wallace and President Biden, because, of course, there are sanctions in place against Iran, and hence there's been quite an uproar on why they are allowed or why they are supplying the Shahed 136. The Shahed 136, it's like a small plane. It's 1.8 metres across, and we have a photograph here, I think, of the Shahed drone, and it carries the explosive in its nose cone, and it's programmed that it will come in on a target, it can hover, and then when instructed, drop its payload.
Because I've heard people describe these things as akin to, in terms of the effect they have on the population, akin to, you know, Hitler's unmanned V1, V2 rockets that he fired, because people are sort of terrified by just the height of them and the sound of them. And when they're waiting there to pick their target, it could be a human target, presumably.
Yeah, the Ukrainian people are calling them the flying lawnmowers, because literally they sound like a petrol-driven lawnmower, and of course, as you say, a bit like the V2 bombers that came in. Then the noise cuts out and they drop. Let's not forget, Ukraine also has them. They have a Turkish-made drone called the Bayraktar TB2. That's the size of a small plane. And is used mainly for, it's used for aerial reconnaissance, but again, it can also deliver laser-guided missile systems.
Right.
The real challenge in Ukraine is that the Shahed, the kamikaze, actually gets launched in swarms. So it can be launched up to 12 at a time.
And where is the belief that they're being launched from then, exactly?
Well, they're either coming from Belarus or they'll be coming from Russia itself. Again, we have footage here.
So they've got a reasonable range then?
Yeah, they have a reasonable range. We have footage here showing Ukrainian soldiers, last safe moment, trying to shoot them down with their own personal weapons. That's kind of like trying to throw a stone at a pheasant. Take it out of the sky.
You get lucky.
You get lucky, but it's not easy. That said, Zelensky reckons they've taken about 60% of the drones fired at them.
And why now the use of drones? Because up until now, they haven't used them, have they?
No, and I think this probably leads us back again to the breakdown in the Russian logistics and supply systems.
Right.
You know, they are running low on resources. They're running low on manpower,
Right.
as we know. And these are a much cheaper
Very effective,
version.
I suppose.
Some of the smaller commercial drones are sort of 12, 15, 1,700 quid. The Shahed is just under £18,000. That's a lot less than a few million for example, the Turkish-made drone.
Right, and so does it also tie in with Russia's apparent targeting now of more civilian sort of areas and more civilian buildings as well?
Well, yeah, and I think people I've been speaking to in the military have said that actually the deployment of a lot of the cruise missiles and the drones from Russia, whilst making the headlines of going into playgrounds and hospitals, it's not actually that effective. They really should be targeting military units, military bases. That said, Zelensky's already said that 30% of their power stations have been knocked out.
Yeah.
And that is a good use. That's really what they should be used for, to
Well, of course,
disable the infrastructure.
To go back to the Second World War, that was the mistake Hitler made, wasn't it? He stopped bombing the airfields and he started bombing London and various cities. And instead of crippling the Air Force, he allowed the Air Force to get back up and sort of defend itself.
And it's interesting, Penny Mordaunt, when she spoke yesterday, talked about this wasn't a war just in Ukraine. This was a global economic war.
Yeah.
And I think, it's having an effect on us all, not just knocking out the power stations in Ukraine, but it's having a direct effect to all of us at home, on fuel, on gas, on heating, on supplies to Africa. And I suspect that that's also on the agenda in Washington.
Yes, I expect so, as Belarus will be, presumably, as well.
Well, Belarus is that's a really interesting point, because Belarus and Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, has been Russia's single most influential ally. And one has to remember that 2 years ago, Lukashenko managed to keep hold of power in Belarus, thanks mainly to the Kremlin providing both security officers and cash.
Yes.
What was announced out of Minsk on Monday is that Belarus is now going to hold training exercises on the ground, live firing exercises and missile launch exercises with a new grouping. This is a Russian formations using the Belarus east and central provinces for their training. I suspect Lukashenko didn't want that. When challenged on it, Lukashenko's excuse, and this is absolute first-class Russian propaganda, is that due to Poland and NATO and the US dragging his country into the war, he feels forced to comply with Putin's request.
Right.
And the last thing he wants is to get drawn into that war, because he will lose power.
Yeah.
Simple as. So this is going to be really interesting to look at that relationship between Putin.
But he's already had meetings with him, hasn't he? They had a meeting in St. Petersburg last weekend.
That's correct.
In which they discussed whatever it was that they're going to now do for Russia. Presumably, when you say reluctantly, he doesn't really have much of a choice, does he?
Well, like most of our political leaders, at the end of the day, it's the people who tend to decide whether they're there or not.
Yeah.
And I think if he goes along and allows himself to get drawn in, then the people in Belarus will start having a say, and he won't want to start losing his grip on power.
No, but we shall see. We shall watch that with interest. So what have we got coming up? Because we're almost, unbelievably, at the end already of our little briefing session.
Well, winter's arriving, isn't it? And one of the other topics that will be on Ben Wallace's agenda and the US is how do we support Ukraine through the winter? We mentioned when we spoke back in the sort of second episode that surprise, keeping up momentum, and most importantly, keeping up morale are three significantly important principles of war.
Yeah.
I suspect that the provision of winter kit, Gore-Tex, thermal clothes, thermal imaging, night vision systems will be on the agenda, because there could just be an opportunity for Zelensky to use the winter to counterattack and actually go after those areas that Russia has taken. And if he does that, then Putin's got real problems on his hands.
Yeah, because the Russian forces presumably aren't as well equipped, can't be as well equipped, and won't be able to get as well equipped.
Their morals are at rock bottom. They're even handing female prisoners back.
Are they? Goodness me.
108 Ukrainian female prisoners were exchanged for Russian, effectively, what they called seamen, maritime merchant seamen. They did 110 for 108.
Right.
That's good news.
That is good news. Well, we'll be watching with interest. Hugh, thank you very much indeed. We'll be back, of course, with another episode of Putin's War next week.